The dramatic story of the spies that Moses sends to scout the promised land before the Jews would enter it is a story that appears to make absolutely no sense. Moses tells these spies, hand-picked individuals, leaders of the nation, to go to the land and report back how best the Jews should approach it in order to conquer it as God had promised them. And instead, the spies come back and they say, cannot be done. The people who live there are more powerful than us, and the Talmud says they actually implied that the residents of Canaan were more powerful than God himself. They used the expression, even the Balabayis, even the owner of this land is not strong enough to remove his own items, meaning those who live in the land from the land. Now, we know that in the Torah doesn't just tell us history, it doesn't just tell us stories, it's there to teach us lessons. The word Torah comes from the word hoirah, which is lessons. And so it's supposed to teach us a lesson for our own lives. And we've got to understand, well, what is the lesson from this terrible story where the Jewish nation, hearing the reports of the spies, dissolves into despair? And we do know that as a result of them crying and complaining, God says, well, you've cried for no good reason on this night, which happened to be the 9th of Av. Throughout history, this will be the night and the day of Jewish mourning, and we need to fix that. And we know that in Judaism, the way that you repair a problem is you've got to get to the source. You've got to work out what caused the problem in the first place, and you have to reverse that. So it's important for us to know the story so that we can know what we're supposed to do to reverse the impact of what the spies did. But there also has to be a lesson that applies in our lives every single day, not only once a year on the day of national mourning on Tisha B'Av. So what is the lesson from this strange story? And it is a strange story because when we look at it objectively, nothing makes sense. Here is a Jewish nation who had left Egypt under the most miraculous circumstances. This wasn't a story that was passed down through the generations. You know, when we were young, when your grandparents were young, they saw miracles, and we should commemorate these miracles on an annual basis. They were eyewitnesses to these experiences. They had seen the 10 plagues. They had watched God personally take them out of Egypt. They had witnessed the splitting of the sea. And besides which, on a daily basis, they were living with miracles. They were surviving on miracles. To live in the desert. How does one live in the desert in those days? Absolute exposure to the sun, to the heat, to the venomous snakes, to the scorpions that lived in the desert. How do you feed yourself in the desert? Where do you find clothing? Where's there water in the desert? And the Torah says that God addressed every one of those needs miraculously. So they lived in this miraculous biosphere, which was comprised of clouds that surrounded them on all four sides and above them to shield them from the sun, and below them to keep the path smooth and to get rid of any dangerous creatures that they might encounter. And it's interesting because the sages tell us that the kind of venomous creatures who lived in the desert at that time were beyond anything. There were these mutant creatures that were far more dangerous than anything that we're aware of today. And yet the clouds fumigated the area and kept it free of any danger. How did they eat? They had this incredible delivery every single day of the most magnificent food product that tasted like anything you could imagine. It had absolute nutritional value to the extent that there was no waste product. Not only that, it was a spiritually powerful food. We're told that those who ate the manna were the only people in a spiritual position to be able to receive God's Torah. So every single day they are reminded of the fact that God has their back. How did they drink? There was a miraculous well that moved in the desert with them. As they traveled from place to place, that original rock, which becomes known as the Well of Miriam, moves with them, and it irrigates the entire camp. There are these streams of water right through all of the different segments of where the Jewish people lived. And it was beautiful, fresh water. Their clothing, the Torah tells us that they never had to worry about clothing because the clouds also had the ability to somehow keep them fresh and laundered, and they even grew with them. So you never had to worry about the next season and what fashion are you going to be wearing and what are you going to buy for your children who have had a growth spurt, because everything was cared for by Hashem. And now they're going into this land. And of course there's a fear because there are 7 Canaanite nations who were divided into 31 kingdoms. And it was quite a daunting thought to provoke them and to attack them. But then again, they had witnessed incredible miracles in terms of fighting Egypt. Remember, Egypt was a world superpower. And they had seen how God dismantled Egypt in no time. Surely they should have believed that if God promises them access to the promised land, it's going to happen. Surely if they were living with miracles on a daily basis, they should have been confident that there would be miracles when God would honor his promise. And it's a promise, a divine promise, that they would enter the promised land. That's why it's called the promised land. So how did they dissolve into despair? How did they lose their faith? How is it possible that they hand-picked leaders of the community who Moses felt would be the best people for the job, that these are the individuals who are going to come back and say, no can do. We have absolute faith in God that we can survive a desert. We have absolute faith that we should walk out of Egypt not knowing where we're headed, how we're going to feed our families. That much faith we have. But faith that we're going to conquer the nations in Canaan, that just seems to be a step too far. What's interesting is we know that out of the spies, 2 of the spies stayed the path. They kept very focused. They retained their faith. That was Joshua and Caleb. And they were the ones who tried to push back against these negative reports from the spies, and they weren't very well received. Joshua in particular, people were very critical of his defense of Moses' promise and God's promise of going into the promised land. But Caleb, his approach is very interesting. He effectively says to the Jewish people, he says, okay, now listen, let me get your attention. And he successfully does get their attention, kind of plays a bit of a switcheroo on them. He says, you think this is the worst that Moses has done? And everybody's ears prick up and they start listening. He says, he took us out of Egypt and he's done all these great things for us. So we should trust him. But he uses an interesting expression. He says, Oloi na'ale veyorashnu oiso. Let us rise, and let us rise. It's a double expression, which is not by accident. And we will inherit this land. Now, you would have expected, if you've got this groundswell of individuals who have lost their faith, who don't believe that it's possible to be able to conquer the land of Israel, and they feel that this is going to be a suicide mission, then surely Caleb should have used the most rational approach, which is to say, guys, hang on a second. Let's remember, we're being fed by miracles daily. We're being protected by miracles daily. We have seen the downfall of the world's superpower that dominated us for over 2 centuries. And like this, they fell with Hashem's promise and with his miracles. Surely he should have convinced them, miracles are the way we roll. This is how we work. So there have been miracles, there will be miracles. And he doesn't say that. He doesn't say a word about it. He just says, be positive, stay the course, be optimistic. We will actually rise up against these people and we will vanquish them. You would have expected him to use the most powerful logical argument that he could have used. We are a miraculous nation. He doesn't breathe a word about it. Now, on analysis, you might say, look, it's true that the Jews had escaped Egypt. That was a huge feat. No slave, even an individual slave, had escaped before. And here we're talking about 600,000 males between the ages of 20 and 60. That's what the Torah records. So you can extrapolate it out, and it's somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million people who have to escape Egypt. Yes, that was a big deal. But now they're up against 7 Canaanite nations, and there are 31 kingdoms in Canaan at the time. Maybe it's just that they had enough faith to believe we saw the exodus from Egypt. It was a great experience. It was a great success. But this is a far bigger ask. You're going to be standing up against much more powerful nations or greater nations or more nations. And maybe that's what scared them. Well, the truth of the matter is that's not a good explanation for why they melted into disbelief. First of all, when the Jews celebrated after seeing the Egyptians drown at the time of the splitting of the sea, part of what they said in their song of praise, which is called Oz Yashir, is they said, Namoigu kol yoshvei Canaan. The impact of the story, both of the exodus from Egypt, and then much more so after the story of the drowning of the Egyptian army at the splitting of the sea, literally melted the hearts and the strength of the Canaanite nations. That means to say they knew that they were facing a weakened enemy, a dramatically weakened enemy. In fact, fast forward, because we know the end of the story, that because of this failure of the spies, they land up traveling through the desert for 40 years. So we also know what happens at the end of those 40 years, where Joshua sends 2 scouts of his own to the promised land, and they come back having heard from Rachav, who becomes the woman that firstly accommodates them, then hides them, and eventually joins the Jewish people. And she tells them, you have to know, 40 years down the line, everybody's still shaking in their boots because we remember the miracles that God did for the Jewish nation, the exodus from Egypt, and specifically the splitting of the sea. So if 40 years later they are still literally trembling in fear about the impending attack of the Jewish nation, it's far-fetched to believe that the Jews at this point, the Israelites, are going to be afraid. Well, what about these nations? There are more of them than there were of Egypt. And possibly the most important factor to consider is that the Talmud tells us an axiom: whoever chooses to persecute the Jewish nation rises to dominance. They become the world superpower. And you can track this throughout the course of history. There's this interesting bell curve of nations who rise up against the Jewish people. They catapult into stardom. They become these massive empires. And then when their work is done, meaning to say they've run the course of whatever God wanted them to do in terms of persecution of the Jewish people, and that's subject for another conversation, why God wants that, but then they kind of disappear from history. So Egypt, who were the dominant persecutors of the Jewish people, they held us for 210 years in captivity. They were the world superpower. We know that from the story of Joseph. We know that they controlled the world economy at that time. We know that they fought wars against their neighboring countries, and they overwhelmed them. And the likelihood is that the Canaanite nations were actually quite reliant on Egypt as their epicenter of society. Egypt was the dominant superpower of the time, not only in the sense that they controlled the Jewish nation and whichever other slaves they might have had, but they controlled the whole region. So if Egypt falls, the Canaanite nations are unseated. They're unstable. They haven't yet had the opportunity to establish a new superpower, to establish a new force in the region, to establish a new empire. So if the Jews are confident that God could wipe out Egypt as he did, and again, it's not something they read in a book or heard from their ancestors, they saw it with their own eyes, it's really far-fetched to believe that they would worry about God's capabilities against the 7 nations and their 31 kingdoms, because they were all teetering at this point in time. Psychologically, they were afraid, and strategically, they were not, at that point, established as an empire. So it really makes absolutely no sense that such great individuals, like these people chosen by Moses to become the spies, that they should return to the Jewish nation having lost absolute faith, having said, as they did, Eretz oicheles yoshveahi, this is a land that swallows up its inhabitants. Well, why? Why would they be so afraid? Why would they not have faith? Why would the nation not have faith? Why wasn't there a pushback from all of the people to say, whoa, you guys have lost the plot. We are living on miracles. How dare you suggest that those miracles will expire because we're going to march in the path that God defined for us? And why did Caleb not mention any of the miracles in his defense of the march to the promised land? And instead he just said, we'll go, we'll succeed, we will rise. There has to be something deeper happening here, and we have to understand what it is. So classical Hasidic teachings point out that what these spies, specifically because they were such great individuals, leaders of the community, advanced spiritually, what they were afraid of was, they weren't afraid of the nations who occupied Canaan. They weren't afraid that the miracles may not be powerful enough to vanquish the land. They weren't afraid that perhaps God was going to let them down. They had a more subtle fear, and that is, they understood what life was like in the desert, and they understood what life would be like in the promised land. And these are completely different realities. Because life in the desert, quite honestly, was a great life. If you're a spiritual person, life in the desert is ideal. You don't have to worry about where you're going to get your next meal. You don't have to worry about earning a living. You don't have to worry about protecting yourself from adversaries, from belligerent parties who might want to attack you, because all of that's taken care of. You're living in this beautiful biosphere that regulates the climate. So it's this beautiful environment. You have food that tastes like anything, that is this spiritual food that is very inspiring and has no waste product. You don't have to worry about clothing because your clothing just grows with you and is always kept fresh. You don't have to worry about clean drinking water because God provides that. You don't have to worry about enemies because the clouds block them out. You don't have to worry about vicious creatures because the clouds fumigate the area. There's absolutely nothing to worry about, in which case, well, what do you do all day? What would you do if you're a deeply spiritual person, as the spies were, and by extension, as the whole generation was? In fact, they are coined by our sages the generation of deep knowledge. What do you do all day if you don't have to worry about the stresses of work and paying your taxes and how you're going to earn a living? What you do all day is you focus on developing yourself spiritually. You have the master teacher of all of history, Moses himself, who's giving daily lectures that you could attend, and then you review that study, and you experiencing godliness. It is a spiritual trip. Now that's going to all stop the minute they cross the Jordan River and they enter into the Promised Land, because entering the Promised Land means life becomes what you and I know as normal. There's going to be stress. You're going to plant your field and hope that the rains come at the right time, and hope that there'll be no pests who devour your crop. And you have to worry about your neighbors and whether they like you or if they're going to attack you. And anybody who's familiar with Jewish history in the biblical era, you know how often we were attacked in a variety of ways. People who tried to take our land, people who stole our crops, people who just attacked us for the sake of murder. So they anticipated. These were intelligent people. These were deeply spiritual people. And they anticipated what's going to happen when they go into the land. And they have to invest themselves into the pursuit of materialism. They have to invest themselves into building homes and establishing the whatever society needs, and earning a living and paying their taxes and defending their borders. And they recognize that the minute that happens, there's going to be far less opportunity to engage spiritually, to be able to develop the soul, because you're so busy investing in the body. And that was not attractive to them. In fact, that was actually something that made them afraid. What if we get swallowed up? Remember they said, it's a land that swallows its inhabitants. They did not mean that there's some kind of weird organic reality that, I don't know, maybe it was swampland that you walk in and it swallows you. What they meant to say is the materialism, eretz, which means earth, or could also refer to artzius, which is earthiness. Materialism is going to overcome us. It's going to swallow us up. We'll lose our spiritual sensitivity. We won't have that ability to focus, to pray for hours in a meditative state, to study Torah without disturbance, because we'll be so busy planting and weeding and plowing and harvesting and producing flour and then baking bread and having to sew our own clothes and whatever other requirements there'd be of living in ordinary society. So that's why they put their brakes on and they said, hang on a second, we don't want this. We'd much rather remain here in the desert. It's a fantastic experience, and it's so spiritual and it's so connected. They also knew, as the sages told us, that as long as you eat the manna, you are naturally inclined to spirituality. That's why we're told that the only people who could receive the Torah had to be people who ate that very spiritual food called the manna. And they were going to lose that. They were going to eat whatever you and I eat. I don't know, gefilte fish. They were going to eat kugel. I don't know what they were going to eat, but it wasn't going to have the same unique properties of the manna. And that's what totally scared them. What if we become swallowed up in a world of materialism? What if we start caring about the car that we drive, or about the clothing that we wear, or the brand name that's on our clothing? Or what if it's keeping up with the Joneses, and we become so obsessed with materialism because that's what the world requires, that we totally lose sight of this tremendous gift that God gave us at Sinai in the desert, where he said, here's my Torah, here's an access point, a portal of connection to me. As the Talmud says, the first word of the Ten Commandments, Anochi, stands for Ano, I, Nafshi, took my soul, Kesavis, and I wrote it into the Torah, Yehavis, and I gave it to you as a gift. So every time you open the Torah and every time you invest in it, you have this wormhole that connects you directly to the essence of God. And we're now going to give that up for the lion's share of every single day of our lives, because we're going to be hacking and knacking in the world. They didn't want that. And that's why they came back and they said, we can't do this. We can't accept a proposal that says, go live in that land, go invest in that materialism. It's going to be our spiritual undoing. That tells you that these were great individuals. These were spiritually oriented individuals. These were people who cared deeply about their own souls, about the souls of their colleagues, about the entire spiritual future of the Jewish people. And they cared deeply about God and his Torah. And that's why they said, we'd rather sit this one out, leave us in the desert, let us be undisturbed, and we'll all become spiritual giants. Now, when you hear it from that perspective, you wonder, they make a good point. Why was God so critical of them? Why was this considered such a terrible misstep that had horrible consequences? What did they get wrong? Well, the classical Hasidic teachings tell us that that is not the purpose of life. God, if he wanted us to live in some kind of a protected environment without any engagement in materialism, he would have kept us as souls in heaven, because that's how it is in heaven. You don't have to worry about earning a living or paying your taxes. But that's not what God intended. He took our very powerful souls and he locked them into our very limited human bodies. And he put us into a world where, unfortunately, or at least it may appear to be unfortunately, we have to engage. We have to earn a living. We have to eat food. Even if you want to perform the requirements of the Torah, you need physical items. You can't sit and meditate about whatever the mezuzah represents. You have to affix the mezuzah to the doors of your home. It doesn't help to study all the intricacies of what goes into kosher food. The food we eat actually has to be kosher. And the reason for that is because God's vision for creation was to create what is called dira b'sachtonim, which means a home for God in the least likely environment, in the lowest, most limited, most materialistic possible place, aka planet Earth. If you had to speak the language of angels, they'd say, this is a ridiculous project. Doesn't make any sense. If you want access to God, steer clear of anything that is an obstruction, that is a distraction, a temptation. Just float around in a spiritual realm, and that will help you to connect to God. But in fact, that's not what God wanted. God wanted us to be right here, wearing whichever particular clothing it is that we wear, driving the car that we drive, invested in the physical world without becoming captured by the physical world. You know, you often see people walking their dogs and you wonder, is the owner walking the dog or is the dog walking the owner? And that's the challenge that God put to us. I want you to be in my world. I want you to invest in my world. I want you to partake of my world. I want you to utilize the elements of my world, but remain the master over the world so that you are constantly bringing value to the physical space instead of allowing it to control you. So when the Jews are in the desert, they haven't yet started this project. They haven't yet aligned with God's purpose for creation. They're still in a miraculous environment, which is wonderful. And it supports a tremendous spiritual development, which is great, but it doesn't achieve the purpose for creation. The purpose for creation is to be a citizen of this world, who masters the world, who translates the world from its natural materialistic reality into its potential divine reality. That's why we're here. Now, the spies missed that. The spies loved and embraced the fact that you live outside of the world, that you live in a miraculous, unnatural environment. And that's why Caleb doesn't say to them, look at all the miracles, because the miracles would actually defeat the message he had to convey. The message is, it's not good enough to live with miracles. It's not good enough to live in some altered state of reality where things just fall into place and your food is dropped at your door every single day and it's only got spiritual elements and components to it, and it doesn't produce waste matter, and you don't have to worry about clothing and you don't have to worry about enemies. That's great. So God did miracles for us. He'll do miracles in the future. That wouldn't work for Caleb's argument, because what Caleb needs to tell the Jewish people is miracles are wonderful as long as they don't extract you from the reality of this world. So all of the great miracles we are seeing, the manna, the well of Miriam, the clouds that protect and look after us, those are miracles that don't really work in the long term. It's a temporary state for us to get us started on our journey to serve God, but these are miracles that keep us outside of the materialistic world, which means we don't have an impact, which means we can't make a difference, which means we cannot elevate the world, which means we're not yet aligned with the divine purpose. So the spies come from a completely different headspace. They say, no, you've got to understand what's going on over here. If you want to have an impact on the world, you've got to be solid. You can't expose yourself to the world. You can't be vulnerable to the temptations of the world and then hope that you're going to impact the world. So their attitude is, Caleb, we get it. We understand what you're saying. Potentially, conceptually, principally, we should have an impact on the world. The purpose of creation is in order to elevate the world into a divine space. We get all of that. But we actually believe you should do it by remote. So keep the Jews locked into a spiritual protected space. We will then become the greatest spiritual giants possible, and will radiate some kind of energy into the rest of the world that eventually will rub off. and eventually will make a difference. And some point in the future, the world will become that divine space that God envisaged. But if you expect us to enter into the world, and you expect us to relinquish our miracles, and you expect us to expose ourselves to the world, well, then you've made a very serious mistake, the spies believe. Because what you've done then is you've said, God creates the natural environment. And whatever God creates is real. So if God creates it to be a natural environment and God creates it to be a materialistic environment, you and I don't have the power to actually make a difference to that. So if God has chosen, in fact, for that space to be a materialistic space, then even God himself can't move the furniture out of that space. The master of the environment cannot play with the rules he made for that environment. So if we are going to have an impact on the world, we have to stay away from that materialistic environment, because once we step out into that world and expose ourselves, we will not have the power to change it. So the spies are not rejecting wholesale what Caleb is teaching, because that is an axiom of Judaism, that the purpose of life is to transform the world into a divine space. They're just reticent about actually crossing the Jordan River and being in that space. They want to have a remote, long-distance relationship with the world where they build up this superpower of spirituality that changes the world. And they cannot fathom the possibility that you could step into the world and you could actually make a difference and not be swallowed by the world. And if you think about it, that line of thinking is quite contemporary. There are many people in the religious world today who want to do exactly that. They want to close themselves off from the world, believing that they'll then protect their own, that they'll grow themselves spiritually, and somehow that will radiate and will be the light unto the nations and will make an impact on the world. And they're afraid of the thought of engaging with the world, because who knows what price we'll end up paying. So to respond to that, both Caleb and his colleague Joshua say you've missed a key point. And they use a very interesting expression. They say, Im chafetz banu Hashem. If Hashem desires us, then we can succeed. And they go on to say that you don't have to worry about the nations who occupy that land, because ki lachmeinu heim, they are like our bread, which is supposed to imply that as easy as it is for a person to control the bread that they eat, it will be that easy for us to overcome the nations who live in Canaan. But actually, Joshua and Caleb are saying something which is far more profound than that. In Jewish mysticism, we speak about the power of will. In the modern world, we often speak about willpower. How much willpower do you have to stop smoking or not to eat a second helping of dessert? In Hasidic mysticism, we talk about the principle of the power of will, what we call ratzon. Willpower is, or the power of will is so incredible that when a person sets their mind to something, it says that this is what I deeply want, no force in the world can stop them. And we know this from our own experience. If you really, really want something in life, and these are all the success stories that we hear from people when they tell us about how they built their empire or how they developed a career, when everybody told them that they would never succeed and they went on to become a gold medalist or they went on to become a billionaire, because they had this very deep will that pushes through all of the either perceived or real obstacles to create success. Then we speak about something even deeper than will. God's will is that this world should become a divine place. God's will is that we should all be aligned with his intentions, that we should all study the Torah, that we should all pray, that we should fulfill the mitzvahs. That's God's will. But the deepest part of his will, which is the word chafetz, the word that Joshua and Caleb use, chafetz means something that is such an inherent will, something that is so core to who you are, that it is unthinkable and impossible that it should not come to fruition. Im chafetz banu Hashem. Joshua and Caleb are saying, you need to understand that what's going on in this particular mission of taking the world and transforming and elevating it into a place that is a divine space, that is something that sits at the core, so to speak, of what God is all about. Meaning, there is no force in the world that could interfere with this project. This is God's project. This is God's number one project. This is his deepest desire. It is unthinkable that he could have created a world that would undermine his deepest desire. So yes, to you and I, it looks daunting. And to you and I, it appears that This is impossible. How can we take a materialistic world and expose ourselves to that world and at the same time master that world? That's okay, because it's not you and I who have to do this. This is the divine, deepest desire that will be channeled through us, in which case nothing in the world could stop it. Not only can nothing in the world stop it, but those same forces that you believe are going to be the interference, that they're going to be the obstacles, they become like our bread. See, the thing about bread or food in general is that unlike, let's say, clothing is part of what we wear. It allows us to protect ourselves against the elements. It allows us to represent ourselves to the world in a particular fashion, but it doesn't become part of us. So when you've had enough of the suit, you can throw out the suit. Food becomes part of who we are. It becomes part of our blood flow. The food translates into our fat cells. And so when we speak about Lachmeinu Haim, Joshua and Caleb telling the Jewish people, don't worry about those forces out there that you think are so overwhelming that we'll never be able to conquer. Don't worry. Lachmeinu Haim. We will absorb them into our reality. We'll make them part and parcel of the process. They're only at the moment apparent obstacles to the process because we haven't engaged them, because we haven't yet opened their eyes to what Hashem expects. But when we do that, they will be absorbed into the system in the same way as food is absorbed into our anatomy. And they will become our allies, and they will become part of the divine space that God envisages for this world. So we need not be afraid, say Joshua and Caleb. We can do this, we can go, we can conquer the world with great success, and in fact turn materialism into divinity, which is the purpose of creation. In the mind of the spies, they believe that our world is very limited. It's a very finite environment. It is possible to get swallowed up in the materialism of this world, and therefore a better way to live is in a supernatural way, to live with miracles, to live in your biosphere in the desert, protected from the external elements and provided for by Hashem himself. Turns out, though, that miracles are great. Miracles are more powerful than the natural experience, and there is something even more powerful than miracles. And that is when you synthesize the supernatural with the natural. There's an interesting Jewish teaching which says that when a miracle is hidden within the course of nature, it's in fact a greater miracle than an obvious miracle. That's why, for example, Purim is such an incredible holiday, because all of the miraculous events that saved the Jews from Haman's terrible plan were disguised as ordinary things. It so happens that the queen was Jewish. It so happens that Mordechai had saved the king's life, and therefore he owed him a favor, where in fact there are these incredible miracles taking place. So in Judaism, we're not excited about breaking the natural order in order to experience a miraculous state. We're excited about seeing godliness within the ordinary. So a great illustration of that is, remember that the epicenter of Jewish life is Israel. Within Israel, it's Jerusalem. Within Jerusalem, it's the Temple Mount. On the Temple Mount, it is the temple. And the tuning fork, the core, the essence of the whole of Judaism is in what is called the Holy of Holies, literally the most divine place on earth. Inside that Holy of Holies was the ark which contained within it the tablets that God had given to Moses at Mount Sinai. And the nature of that ark defies not only nature, but logic. Because on the one hand, the Torah gives very definite dimensions for the ark. 2.5 cubits by 1.5 cubits, and you could measure it. And you could see that the ark went from this point to that point, and this is how big it was. The Holy of Holies, the room that housed the ark, also had very specific dimensions. You could measure it from wall to wall, and these were real dimensions. What's perplexing about the ark is that while the ark occupied space, you could measure it, it equally didn't occupy space simultaneously. Which means, if I measured the ark from top to tail, it was 2.5 cubits. If I measured the space on either side of the ark to the wall of the Holy of Holies, and I added that together, 5 and 5 cubits, what do I get? I get the full length of the room. In other words, the ark is not a hologram. The ark is a physical reality that is measurable and finite, while simultaneously not occupying any space. That is mind-blowing. We can't wrap our heads around it. We can't even imagine what that looks like. And that is the ultimate expression of divine energy. within and beyond reality simultaneously. Within reality because you can measure it, and beyond reality because the measured space of the ark actually takes up no space. In the same way, we could live a natural reality, which is you go to work, you make money, you eat food, if you look after your health, you'll be healthy. And then there's a supernatural reality, as the Jews experienced in the desert. And in our minds, you can see God more in the supernatural reality than you do sitting in traffic on your way to the office. What the spies didn't realize, and what Caleb and Joshua wanted to convey, is you can find the essence of godliness, the highest level, the most incredible form of the divine, when you see miracles in the normal. Which means you step out of your biosphere, you go into the world, you plant your fields, you pay your taxes, and within that environment, you don't behave like the rest of the population expects you to. You behave in a supernatural way. You bring meaning and holiness and a divine energy to food and to money and to social interactions and to exercise. So the step from the desert, which is a supernatural state, into Israel is not a downgrade. It's a tremendous upgrade. It's a radical upgrade. It is moving out of an environment that says you get a binary choice. Either you're in the world or you're beyond the world, and you enter into God's space, which is anything is possible. You can be in the finite human world and in the divine infinite world simultaneously. That's actually what Caleb says to the Jewish community. He says, Aloi na'aleh. Not only can we enter the land, not only can we overcome those nations who live there, but it will be an aliyah, it will be a spiritual elevation for us. Not only will it be a spiritual elevation as you anticipate, which is not to be fettered by the limitations of this world, but to live your idyllic lifestyle as you're experiencing now in the desert. Guess what? We're going to go beyond that. Not only are we going to add more to the bouquet of spiritual experiences, we're going to introduce a different level of aliyah, a different level of transformation and transcendence, which you cannot even begin to imagine. And that is to be so elevated that you can actually be in your space and comfortable in your space. To put it differently, very often when we feel uncomfortable in an environment, we feel we have to escape that environment so as not to be distracted by it or harmed by it or pulled down by it. And God's message is you can be in that challenging environment. Not only will it not affect you negatively, not only will it not drag you down or swallow you up, as the spies wanted to say, but it's going to be the catapult of spiritual development and growth that you could never have anticipated. Oloi, you're going to elevate to the extent that you would have imagined. Na'aleh, you're going to elevate exponentially beyond what you could have possibly imagined. So not only will you be able to escape the challenges of this world, but you'll actually be able to use the challenge of this world to become whole, to become elevated, to become transformed, and to take the world with you. And that's why Joshua and Caleb tell the Jewish nation, we will inherit this land. You know, there are various transactions that a person can do in life. You could sell an item to somebody. And when you sell an item, you effectively say, this used to belong to me, and now thanks to our transaction, it belongs to you. And the same is with a gift. The asset used to be mine, and I'm giving it to you as a gift. So what happens in either a sale or a gift is we move the item from jurisdiction of person A into jurisdiction of person B. Inheritance does not work that way. It's not as though the person who has passed away now hands over their assets to their heir. It's the exact reverse. When a person passes away and they have named somebody as their heir, the heir now replaces them. We don't move the asset from location A to B. We replace the owner with a new owner. In other words, inheritance captures the essence of who the original owner was. I'm not just getting their stuff, I'm getting their position, I'm getting their status. And that's exactly what happens when we step into this world, which is a challenging world, the physical environment, with all of the temptations and distractions of our world as we know it, whether it be from WhatsApps to social media to the temptations of things which the Torah does not want us to do. We step into that environment as an heir of God. It's not just that we're transferring something that used to previously be very physical and now we're giving it a spiritual designation. We're actually stepping, if you could say this, into divine shoes. We're approaching the world from the divine perspective. We're capturing the essence of God rather than just the miracles that God does. In the desert, you tasted God's miracles. When you engage the world as we're supposed to, you connect to God's essence. And that's a very relevant lesson in our lives, because we'll all have desert phases in our lives and Canaan phases in our lives, or conquering Canaan phases in our lives. In other words, we also spend time either at different stages of life or on a daily basis where we are secluded from the world. A person may, for example, attend a yeshiva, which is a very protected environment. You're completely immersed in study, you're completely immersed in prayer, you're inspired consistently by people, and you don't have the impact of the rest of the world on you. I remember being in yeshiva and once commenting to a friend of mine as we were walking down from our daily studies to have lunch and saying, think about this for a moment. We have not a worry in the world. We don't have to pay the tuition. Food is supplied every single day, 3 times a day. We have a place to sleep, and we're being inspired all day long. Life doesn't get better than this. So we all have these phases in our lives on a daily basis as well. If you pray every morning or every evening, or you study Torah, that's a time to step out of the world, to be in this protected environment where you don't feel exposed to all of the things that nature throws at us. But we don't stay there. We also have a section of the day, usually the lion's share of the day, where we are out there and exposed. We're sitting in the office. We're engaging with people in the shopping mall. We're running on our morning jog, or whatever the case is. And we're exposed to the world at that point in time. So the lesson of the spies is a lesson that speaks to every single one of us, because it may be very tempting, if you're on a spiritual trajectory, it might be very tempting to say, you know what, I just want to close myself off from the world, never own a phone, not have the internet, not engage with business, just live in a protected environment, live off some kind of welfare, and immerse absolutely in the spiritual. And that would be like living in the desert. It would not fulfill the objective of life. The objective is to get out there, to make a difference, to transform the world to become a divine place as God intended it. Now, the truth of the matter is we could take this to a whole different level as well, because when we look at some of the more complex mystical texts, they describe that there are 3 phases of interaction that we have with the world, or that our soul has with the world, and that is the mechanism of thought that allows our soul to communicate with us, speech, which allows us to communicate either our emotions or our thoughts or our spiritual orientation to the world, and action, which allows us to make an impact. So the spies, according to the mystical texts, wanted to remain in the world of thought, which is an environment where, okay, we'll engage the world, we'll have an impact internally. In other words, I'll live in my own head. I'll meditate and I'll study. I'll even affect my immediate environment in a positive way, because ultimately that is the objective of Judaism, right? Which is to turn the world into a divine place. So I'll do that. I'll do that in my little enclave. But I don't want to have to get involved with other people. I don't want to have to influence other people who perhaps are not as spiritually in touch as I am. That's going to take up my time. It's going to distract me from my objective. So I'd rather live, the mystics tell us, in the world of thought than engage in the world of speech. Speech means I have to connect with somebody else. You know how it is when you want to have a conversation. You can't just spurt out words, like those AI voices. You've actually got to engage with a person. And somebody who's on a spiritual path may say, I don't want to have to engage with people, especially people who are nowhere near my spiritual level. I don't want to have to talk to them, explain to them, teach them, educate them, connect them. Let me look after my little space. I'll find people who are on the same page as I am. We'll form a little community. We'll connect. We'll have a spiritual impact on our little spot on earth, and others can take care of the rest of the world. So that's another layer of the lesson from the spies. It's actually not good enough. It's not good enough for an individual to only care for their spiritual development. We have to, every one of us has a responsibility to engage somebody else, to inspire somebody else, to speak to somebody else. We all know somebody who could be better connected to their Jewish identity, to their Jewish heritage. We have a responsibility to those people. We have to speak to them. We have to convey to them that Judaism is not some kind of an escapism where you just lock yourself away from the world and don't be a productive citizen, but rather we interpret how to be a productive citizen in a way that transforms and elevates the world. Now, The interesting thing about human psychology is that we've got what we call a Yetzer Hara, which is poorly translated as an evil inclination, but it's really the toxic self-defeating thoughts that we all have that prevent us from growing as well as we should. And that voice inside of us says, whoa, hang on a second, you're on a spiritual path, you're trying to develop yourself, you want to build a connection to God. If you're going to start teaching others, inspiring others, it's going to go to your head, and before you know it, you're going to walk around with this bloated sense of self. And that is a barrier to connection to God. After all, the Talmud does tell us that if a person is arrogant, they chase God out of their space. So we don't want that to happen to you by turning you into some great mentor or some great preacher. Terrible word. We don't want to associate that word with ourselves. So don't go out there. Don't try and have an impact on somebody else, because you're going to lose all that hard work at retaining a sense of humility. Joshua and Caleb addressed that. They said, remember, im chafetz banu Hashem. Now you could read that literally as if God wishes for us or cares about us or wants us to succeed. Obviously we'll succeed. But we could also read it as if we want what Hashem wants, then we will succeed. When we're on our own path, blowing our own trumpet, trying to develop our own legacy, it's very likely that we'll get distracted. It's very likely that we'll turn arrogant. Can happen. A person who's pursuing making a name for themselves is quite vulnerable to becoming full of themselves. Whereas if I say, I'm reaching out to other people, not because I need the recognition, not because I want to have the satisfaction of feeling I had an impact, but rather because that's what God expects of me, that will protect me. And I'll have a positive impact, and that could in turn become a cascading impact on others, because I'll touch people who will touch people, and that way we could literally change the whole world. And I don't have to worry about it going to my head, because if I am focused on doing things for God's sake, God will ensure that I'm safe. Then, however, so that would be the person who's switching from the mode of thought, which is, I'm just going to look after myself, just like my thoughts speak to me, I'm going to look after my world, into the world of speech, which is, I'm going to connect with others and have an impact on them. But that same Yetzer Hara self-defeating voice says, that's fine, as long as you have something in common with those people. Don't get in contact with people who are, so to speak, the rogues of the nation. Don't get involved with those people who have turned their backs on their Judaism. Don't get involved with those people who have absolutely no sensitivity to the Jewish message, because that's going to drag you down. Well, there again, we have the lesson from the Meraglim, from these spies. And the lesson is, it's not good enough for us to translate the thoughts that we experience, which means our own version of Judaism, only into conversation with others. We actually have to translate it into action. And the key takeaway from the story of the spies is, the most important thing is action. If you wanted a spiritual environment, you would have stayed in the desert. If God had expected us all just to develop our own personal spiritual development, we'd still be in the desert, protected by clouds and being fed manna even today. But that's not what God wants. He wants us to go out there and make a difference, have an impact. As the sages say, ha'maaseh hu ha'ikar. What we do is most important. And what we do is not only in the context of humans. You speak to humans. You don't necessarily speak to rocks, but you can do something with a rock. You could take a rock, you could fashion it and turn it into something which is really valuable and beautiful. And so the lesson is, not only do we engage with those who are, so to speak, in our environment, who are relatable, we have a responsibility to engage with every single member of the Jewish world, because every one of us has equal value to contribute in fulfilling God's dream for this world, which is turn the world into a divine place. And so the take-home message from the story of the spies is not to delude ourselves into believing that if we corral into a little group and look after our spiritual interests, that will do us well. It will actually be exactly contrary to the divine plan. The divine plan is engage the world, do the things that Judaism says, recognize the value of every single Jewish person as an actor in this great plan that God has, and let's turn the world into a place of divine energy, not just a place where miracles break the order of nature, but where miracles are part and parcel of what we always thought was the limited environment of nature. And when we do that, we fulfill the divine plan, which obviously brings tremendous blessing to all of us, and the ultimate blessing of all, the coming of Moshiach, where all of this theory will translate into how the world appears, not only to us, but to every inhabitant of this earth.